Hi, I'm Jane Minton, and I'd like to welcome you to a workshop on being successful in the classroom. I work at John A. Logan, and I've worked here for about 20 years working with students and helping them be successful. I hope I can give you some ideas today that you'll enjoy. First of all, let's talk a little bit about some learning basics, the process of really learning something. First of all, you have to take the information in somehow. From all that information, you then have to figure out what it is you really need to know. You have to consciously store it, and you have to practice retrieving it if you want to recall it quickly. Recalling it quickly is what's really useful on a test or in an emergency. It's really important that you can recall it quickly. Let's talk a little bit about step one of the learning basics. You're going to take the information in somehow. You'll probably read it or listen to the lecture. The only alternative that I can think of might be Braille, but these are the basic ways that people get the information in. They might listen to the textbook, but usually reading it or hearing it are the two main ways that we take information in. I'd like to talk a little bit about learning styles and explain a little bit to you about what they are. We hear about these things, and sometimes we hear correctly and sometimes we don't hear correctly. One of the learning styles that's commonly referred to is the audio learning style. It means simply that the person who's an audio learner has a preference for hearing and the things that they hear. Maybe it's easy for them to remember those things or recall those things later. One example that I like to give of a person who is an audio learner is someone who can go to a movie and then remember lines from the movie after the movie's over. Now, I'm not a person who can do that, but there are plenty of people who are. My son is one of those, and he and friends will talk about, oh, this, and remember talking about exact lines from movies, and not me. I can't remember a thing if I hear it. In fact, I used to joke with my former boss that if she just told me that I needed to do something, it was likely that it wouldn't get done because I need to take it a step further than that. Then we also hear about the visual learner whose preference is sight. Now, this is a tricky one because we tend to think that a visual learner is someone whose preference is reading. That isn't necessarily the case. The visual learner might respond to all different kinds of visual cues. Color, for example, shape, movement, a lot of different things that we don't necessarily think of. So somebody who is a visual learner may not be a person who really enjoys reading, but really enjoys seeing things, and they may be different than what you would expect. We also hear about the tactile learner. The thing that strikes me most about the tactile learner is I often hear people say, oh, that's somebody who's good with their hands. And that, again, is not necessarily the case. Tactile means touch. So the tactile learner may be very sensory when it comes to touching things and feeling textures. For example, a tactile learner may like to touch corduroy or satin or silk, or feel the roughness of something, or be more perceptive when it comes to the way things feel. Also lumped in sort of with the tactile learner is the kinesiological aspect of things. Kinesiology has to do with the study of movement, of the body movement. So when we're talking about a tactile learner, I really think there should be a distinction, but generally speaking, people are also talking about someone who has to do with movement. So the movement and touch kind of go into place at the same way here when we're talking about that particular learning style. And people who are tactile learners are not necessarily good with their hands, but they may be a person who can shoot a basket or a person who can do fine needlework. They're very different kinds of tactile learners. The last one on this list is a multimodal learner, and one of the things that has been discovered lately is that some people prefer more than one of these things going on. Maybe some people prefer audio and visual, or visual and tactile, or maybe all three. I know that I personally do better when I have all three of them going on, so I try to incorporate all of these into my study skills, my study style. Another thing we might want to discuss is Gardner's 8 intelligences, and these are something that are taught in general psychology, but oftentimes without a whole lot of explanation. You're probably familiar with the idea that we have what's called general intelligence, which is how smart we are. Well, Howard Gardner believes that there are other intelligence that have to do with smartness, but in a different sense. The first one is the bodily or kinesthetic sense, and these are people who are comfortable with their bodies. Again, people jump on the fact and say, oh, wow, that's somebody who is a good basketball player or a good athlete. Well, there's, again, more to it than that. I probably couldn't make a basket if somebody said they'd give me $1 million. But I do yoga, and yoga is very much a bodily kinesthetic thing. So we have to expand the way we look at this and look at the person's body comfort level and what they're good at as far as their body is concerned. Intrapersonal people are people who are comfortable with themselves. Intrapersonal people may want to study by themselves. Now, I know plenty of students who don't like to study by themselves. They don't like being in that room. They want quietly by themselves. They want to be out where there are other people, and they say that doesn't bother them that there are other people around, that they just don't want to be by themselves. Interpersonal folks are folks who get along well with others and enjoy that communication back and forth with someone else. So for them, it may be good to sit and work with another person, or discuss with another person, or talk with another person about whatever it is that one is studying. This can become a problem if the person is too interpersonal, because they might want to sit and socialize rather than actually getting down to business. But these are really very different, and sometimes we're comfortable with both. I know lots of people who like to study on their own and who also enjoy studying with others. So these things, on this particular list and the previous list, they're not exclusive. You don't have to be one or the other. I think everyone is probably a mixed bag of these characteristics and talents. The person who is the linguistic person is someone who is very comfortable with words and sentences and communication in traditional, perhaps writing style. Or maybe they are very good at speaking and not so good in the writing department. So again, there are different ways of looking at this, but it's words. Words are the key here. Then we have the logical or mathematic. In college, I found that most people say, I am not good at math. I am not good at math. That's the majority of the people in college. However, they may not be good at certain kinds of math, but that doesn't mean this isn't a strong sense that they have. If we look at the logical part, if you want to learn something or understand something, how do you go about it? Do you want to see the big picture and then look at the pieces so that you understand the whole, or do you want to look at the pieces first and then look at the big picture and see how everything fits together? The logical person is going to want to do one or the other of those, and neither one is right or wrong. It's just a different way that we have going about it. So if you know that you like to look at the big picture and then look at the pieces, perhaps you want to read your chapter first and then look at the parts of the chapter, or vice versa. The person who's musical is just that, and appreciates music or is musical. You don't necessarily have to sing or play an instrument to be musical. You could possibly like the rhythm aspect of music. I'm very rhythmic. I can't carry a tune very well when I sing, but I'm very, very rhythmic and appreciate rhythmic music. So that's a good thing for me when I study. I've learned how to incorporate that into my study time. The spatial or abstract person is able to take something that is in a book that is just a picture on a page, put it in their heads, and maybe manipulate it in their heads so that they can turn around and imagine what it looks like. That's the person who can see it in his head when he's sitting taking a test and imagine what it looks like. He's not memorizing words. He's memorizing the whole and how it appears in his head. Then the natural person is someone who's comfortable with the outdoors. There are plenty of people who are, and there are plenty of people who aren't. So these can be incorporated. Even the natural person can be incorporated into one's study preferences. So I think it's a good idea to think about yourself. And perhaps maybe the best idea of all of this is to stop doing everything the way you used to do it, but to think about some new and different ways you might try to do things. And we'll talk about these as we move along. before the lecture, when you're going to go to class, it's really a good idea if you prepare. And there are a couple reasons for this. One reason is that based on whether you're an audio learner, a visual learner, or whatever kind of learner you are, you're going to get the information for your class somewhere first. So if you don't look at it before you go, the first time that you're going to experience the information is to hear it. So if hearing is not your primary preference, then maybe you would want to take some looks at it before you go. And not necessarily read the chapter in depth, but at least have an idea what the teacher's going to talk about, so that when she begins speaking, it's not like she's speaking in another language. Preparation really is important. Most students really don't do anything to prepare for a class. When they get to the class, the information presented by the teacher is brand new, so it's really hard sometimes to understand and organize your notes as you take notes if you don't know what it is the teacher's talking about. So what happens oftentimes is the student ends up with a page of notes that have absolutely no order nor organization. So doing some serious preparation works best, but doing anything is better than doing nothing. If all you did was take a look at the table of contents of your textbook before you went to class, you would at least have an idea of what's going to be going on in the class. But you say this takes time. Yes, it does. But perhaps it's time to learn the rule of thumb for success in college. Bad news or good news, I don't know. But to earn an A in college, the rule of thumb is 2 to 3 hours outside class for every credit hour inside class. So if you're taking a 3 credit hour class, yes, you're supposed to be spending 6 to 9 hours outside class working on the class. Therefore, you have quite a bit of things to do during that time. And there's no guarantee of an A, but it really does help if you put forth the time. This is one reason why I worry a lot about college students who have a family and a job. I wonder where they're going to find the 6 to 9 hours for each class in order to put in the work that needs to be done. Outside class time should include class preparation, homework, review, studying, and test preparation. Most of the time people do their homework. Most of the time they do what they think is studying in preparing for a test. But I think class preparation is probably somewhere down the line as far as things that don't get done. There's some easy ways to prepare for class, so let's take a look at some of them. There are things that you can do with your textbook before going to class, other than just carrying it around or reading it like a very boring novel. And I don't know how you feel about textbooks, but I find most textbooks very difficult to read. What I like to have people do is check out the table of contents. That's a big secret in studying, is that the table of contents is a list of what you're going to cover in the coming week when you go to class. Most people aren't aware of that. So I suggest that people outline the chapter using the table of contents as a guide. Get your pen, pencil ready and outline the table of contents right there in the book. One of the things that students often don't do is that they don't want to write in the textbook. They want to sell it back and want it to be really good condition so they get as much money as possible. Well, I have news. If you have no marks in that book, but you've carried that book around for an entire semester, even if you've kept it on a shelf and not used it at all, it's still a used book. And the price is going to be the same regardless of how used it is. So I think the purpose of a college textbook is, for the most part, to really use it. So I suggest that you do that. So get out your textbook, take a look at the table of contents, and make a simple outline, 1, 2, 3, ABC. You'll find in the table of contents most of the time that the main points are in bold, and then there are sometimes some subpoints and they're in smaller letters and not in bold. So what I ask students to do is to copy that table of contents into the chapter. Not reading the chapter, but copying the table of contents in, so that they're seeing what the main points of the chapter really are. So copy the table of contents right on through the chapter. Then read and highlight the terms. It doesn't matter if you can pronounce them or not. If you can get that term in your head when the teacher speaks it, you'll say, oh ho, so that's how you say that. And I say highlight. Now, for the first 3 of these, the reason that I'm having you use your pen, pencil, or whatever is that if you can get some, you're seeing it visually, but if you can get some movement of your hand going in this, then you're going to have a little tactile stuff going along. And if you're willing, then just speak these things as you're writing them so that you're seeing them, you're hearing them, and your hand is moving. So outline the table of contents, copy it into the chapter. That's what I call the first pass through the chapter. Then read and highlight the terms. That's the second pass through the chapter. The third pass through the chapter is to go back and look at Roman numeral 1 in your chapter and say, what is the purpose here? I can't tell you how many times I, and other students as well, have gone through entire classes reading a textbook and had absolutely no idea what the purpose was. And yes, it does happen unless we can figure it out. It's also a good idea to look at the chapter objectives, which are usually at the beginning of the chapter. Then read the chapter. If you don't have time to do all these things, do one of them. Start with the table of contents. Start with the terms. Do whatever you need to do to get something in your head, an idea of what's going to happen before you go to class. I recommend the table of contents highly. Here's an example. This is one of the nursing textbooks. First, outline the table of contents. This is it. Table of contents, Chapter 13, Nursing Care for Elderly Clients. There are 3 main points in this chapter. 1, what is aging? 2, physiological changes. 3, cognitive and psychological changes in the older client. And then there's a list of these cognitive and psychological changes in the older client. If I did nothing but this, nothing, I am better prepared than most of the people who go to class with absolutely no idea of what's going to go on. They may say, well, we're going to talk about nursing care of elderly clients, but they really don't know what it is the teacher's going to talk about. This gives them an idea. Here is a marketing book that I've done the same thing with. The teacher can do her lecture, and the students who have looked at the table of contents will know that they're going to talk about what is marketing, that there are 4 eras in the history of marketing, that avoiding marketing myopia, extending traditional boundaries, and so forth. And you can read down there. That student is going to have a better idea of what it is that's going to go on in the classroom. Here I have highlighted, or I've gone through the chapter. First pass through the chapter, I did my Roman numerals and my outline, and then the second pass through the chapter I highlighted the terms. And as I did that, I would speak the term and say intrinsic factors, extrinsic factors, perception, and here's the rest of the chapter as it looks with the outline and so forth. Organize the information in your mind and take a look at each major section one by one and ask yourself, what's the point? So if I'm going to look at section number 2, it says physiological changes. That sounds familiar from the table of contents. Then I'm going to see common physical changes in older clients and their implications for nursing, and a list. Now this list wasn't in the table of contents, I don't think, but it's here, so I'm going to number it, and I'm going to look at it, and I'm going to say what's the point. The point here is common physical changes are changes in the muscular system, the skeletal system. Yeah, that was in the table of contents. The integumentary system, and so forth. Here's the marketing book with the same thing. Again, I went through the whole thing. I wasn't reading anything along the way, or I certainly wasn't looking at the pictures. One of the problems with textbooks is that if we stop and look at the picture, we often get totally sidetracked from what's going on. So the first couple of passes through the chapter, pass number 1 when you're just outlining, pass number 2 when you're looking at the terms, I try really hard not to look at the pictures. Now the third time I go through, when I'm trying to figure out what's the point, yes, I do look at the pictures and the graphs and the charts and all that stuff, because I figure they're related in some way to what it is that's going on. Okay, during the lecture, now let's assume that you did what you were supposed to do and prepared for class, so you come into class having an idea of what the teacher's going to talk about. I ask people, please do not have your book open laying there on the table next to you. Don't follow along in your book if you can help it. Keep your book handy, but don't open it unless your instructor says to do so. Now, why is that? Well, any teacher who has taught for probably more than a couple of years has had to deal with different editions of the book. So the editions of the book don't change significantly most of the time, but there are pieces of information that are in one book that are not in another. They're left out, and that may be a piece of information the teacher likes. The teacher has probably been to graduate school, has a master's degree or a doctorate degree, and learned all kinds of things about her subject. It's also likely that most teachers find information in the daily newspaper or on television and want to include those things with their classes. So let's suppose you're reading along trying to follow and highlight what the teacher's saying, and she starts talking about something and you can't find it in the chapter. Well, it doesn't make the teacher disorganized. It just means that you're going to be lost at that point in time from what it is that she's talking about, because you're not with the book, because it isn't in the book, and you're not with the teacher because you're looking in the book. So that's really not a good thing to do. But now you want to have the book handy so that if the teacher says turn to page 44, you can do that. Another thing to do is to take good notes, ideally the Cornell method of note-taking. I'll give you some examples of this later. Ask questions and contribute to the discussion. Okay, how can you possibly ask questions if you've done nothing before you've come to class? The teacher has probably given an assignment. I have many students who've said to me over the years, no, we don't have any assignments in that class. And I said, are you telling me that your teacher didn't tell you what chapter you're going to be covering this week? Oh, yes, it's on our syllabus. Well, if it's on your syllabus, the idea is the teacher expects you to be keeping up to date and to know what's going on. So when the teacher plans her class, she will probably set aside time for questions and discussion. And one of the things that's hard about being a teacher is when you say, okay, do you have any questions? And everybody sits there like a lump. Well, how could they ask any questions? They don't have a clue what's going on. So it's really, really nice when someone raises her hand and says, yes, I have a question. There was something about the diagram on page 42 that I really didn't understand. And, you know, I think I'm getting it from what you talked about in class, but I'm still not sure. Well, the teacher will be thrilled, because here's a student who is interacting with her and who is actually taking an interest in the class. So it's really a good idea to ask questions, though oftentimes we are reluctant to do that because we think we'll sound stupid. Well, the truth is, if you do something before you go to class, you probably will sound like you know what you're talking about, even if you say you don't. So that's going to be an improvement. This is the Cornell method of note-taking. You use one side of the paper, and I don't know where the Cornell method of note-taking came from. I've looked and searched and done everything I can to try to give credit to whomever it was that thought it up, but I haven't ever been able to find that. I presume it came from Cornell University, but I really don't know. Okay, I teach, as a matter of fact, a class called Death and Dying, and this is an example of my first day's lecture that I've talked about. The 5 ways dying has changed since 1900, and I've given my students those 5 ways. Now, one of the things that you want to do about note-taking, I highly recommend a 3-hole punch paper rather than spiral, and there are a couple reasons for this. One is that if you tear paper out of a spiral notebook, even if it's designed to be torn out, you're still going to have a few raggedy edges unless you're really a perfectionist and not in a hurry. Most teachers are not thrilled with raggedy edge paper because they tangle up. So my suggestion would be use a regular notebook like you did in grade school, probably, that has 3 holes and is a loose leaf notebook. It's just much better. I thought I was so great when I went to college and graduated from the loose leaf notebook to spiral notebooks, and then I found out that spiral notebooks really are not that great. We just think they are. So anyway, as we look at this paper, I put the date at the top, I put the chapter that we're discussing, and I put the name of the person who's talking, which is oftentimes a good idea, because if it's not your teacher talking, suppose you have a substitute or a guest speaker, then maybe your teacher doesn't agree with everything that that person said, so it's a good idea if you're quoting something that you know who it is that said it. So I try to write the teacher's name at the top of the page, or the speaker's name rather. So for my particular class, we talked about the 5 ways dying had changed since 1900 that have caused our attitudes to change. And then the in my notes, I numbered 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Now, the reason I'm mentioning this to you is because I also told my students, gosh, this would be a good midterm question. Well, how do I know that will be a good midterm question the first week of school? Could that be because I've taught this class for about 19 years and I have the same midterm exam every single semester? Likely, that's the case. So if a teacher says, oh, that'd be a good test question, that's probably going to be on the test, because they probably made the test up already. So the smart student would have put a big star by that so that they knew to go back and work on remembering that. Now here is another problem. You want to be sure if it says 5 ways that you've listed 5, that you have the right 5. So this is a reason why the first day of class you might want to get the phone number of somebody else in the class so you can compare notes occasionally. What if you hadn't heard this correctly and you had them listed wrong? Then you would mess up on the midterm. I've also given my students the definition for thanatology. The main causes of death in 1900. Number 1 was pneumonia. Number 2, somebody coughed and I didn't hear it. But you don't want to stop. You just want to keep going with your writing. Draw a line, put a question mark. And then when you get to a break or later in the day or when you get home that night, you can call somebody or you can ask the teacher later and say, I missed that second cause of death. Well, the odds are good. If you missed it because somebody coughed, somebody else missed it too. So they would appreciate your raising your hand and saying that. So take your notes to the right of the line. On this particular page, you'll see that there's a line drawn down the page. There's the regular red line that's on a loose leaf notebook, and then there's another line that's drawn probably about a quarter of the way over, maybe a third of the way from the left margin. So what do we do with that? Just some miscellaneous note-taking tips. Use whatever works for you. There are many styles. There are outline, paragraph, your own style. Never write incomplete sentences if you can help it. Just whatever works for you. Use your own symbols and codes. You want to mark when the teacher says something is important. You want to mark when you don't understand something. You want to mark when you have any reason to mark anything. If you miss something, just leave a blank space and make some kind of a mark so that you know you've missed it. Try to number everything. If the teacher says there are 6 ways, then be sure you write 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Don't worry about complete sentences, and be very careful of PowerPoint handouts. One of the hazards of PowerPoint handouts is that people don't want to take notes. They think that oh boy, here are the notes already made out for me. And in reality, that's probably not a good thing. First place, the PowerPoint lectures are probably the teacher's outline of what it is she wants to speak about. And the odds are good that the PowerPoint notes don't go into any kind of detail. So yes, you do want to take notes on PowerPoint handouts. You know, it's good that they're there, but they're not sufficient in themselves. The other thing that you might do is that perhaps you want to take notes electronically. Some teachers are okay with that, and some teachers are not okay with that. Okay, so far so good, but now what? Too much information. You prepared for the class, you're in the class, you've taken notes, and you go home, and my gosh, what is all this all about? Well, the likely thing that most students will do is to put the stuff in their book bag and not look at it again until much later when it's closer to test time. Not a good idea. Okay, let's talk about how to really study. For most people, reading is not studying. It's just taking in information. So if that's all you do when you study, you're just taking massive amounts of information in over and over and over. I have many a student say to me, I don't understand why I failed the test. I went over it and over it and over it. I spent 6 hours going over it. Well, going over it really doesn't work. You're just taking in information over and over. So, when you get home after the lecture, do your homework, or at school do your homework, wherever it is that you do it, whether it'll be graded or not. Students tell me all the time, well, he's not going to grade our papers, so why should I bother doing that homework? Well, you're doing the homework so that you can learn the subject matter and do well on the test. You're not doing the homework for a grade if it's not going to count for a grade. So it's important for you to do it so you learn it. Look at your notes to be sure you know what was said. If you've taken some good notes, you should be able to organize the information from the lecture and see what it was that the teacher was talking about. I like to compare my notes with the text and find out, did the instructor focus on anything special, or leave out big chunks of information, or skip huge sections, or did the teacher tell you in class, well, we're not going to do the second half of chapter 3, in which case you want to mark through that, or you want to make a note of it somewhere. You want to mark anything your instructor said was important in your notes and in the text, and call somebody if you think you missed something. Now, there's probably a reason that needs some explanation here. One of the things that you'll find out about tests is that there is such a thing as a test bank. Test banks are books that teachers get that have hundreds of test questions in. Most of them are written by the authors of the textbook, and they're geared to the objectives at the beginning of each chapter. The trick here is that the teacher is not making out the test and writing out the questions in her own words. Someone else has written out the test questions in their words. She's just picking the questions. Well, the hard part for the student here is that they will take a look at the test and they will not recognize the words that they see in the question, and they'll think, well, she didn't say that. Well, no, she didn't, but it was in the text. So you really do want to compare what your teacher says with the text so that you understand what it is in different kinds of words. Put it in your own words. Step 2 of learning is extracting what it is that you need to know, and this is what really begins the studying part. You have a huge amount of information, and it is really your responsibility once you get in college to figure out what you need to know. Don't wait for the teacher to provide a study guide. It may not happen, and you need to start immediately while things are still fresh in your mind. If you wait to closer to the test time and you ask the teacher, gosh, what are we supposed to do in chapter 2? It's a huge chapter. What's important? The odds are that the teacher will say everything. And that's really not so. You have to learn how to pick out what it is that you need. And this, I think, is probably the hardest thing in college. From the information you have, you need to start making a need-to-know list of things you need to know, store, retrieve at a later date. This would be terms, formulas, lists already provided in your text, maybe in a little outbox or from your notes. Teacher said it was important, you start it, so put it on your list. Check the table of contents and the chapter outline. Is anything missing drastically? Are you understanding things? Do you have things correct? And make a list using the learning objectives. Now this can be even trickier because the learning objectives are oftentimes very complicated in their sentence. It might say for the nursing class, well, you need to know the kinds and disorders and treatments and diagnoses and complications for elderly patients with kidney disease. Well, that's not just a simple sentence, because that's a whole bunch of little lists. You have to learn the kinds, you have to learn the symptoms, etc., etc. So that's a lot of things you have to learn. Looked simple in one sentence, but it really is not. So let's take another look at the Cornell method of note-taking. Your notes are pretty good, so what are you going to do with this now? What could you do? Well, here's what I've learned to do. Okay, I've learned to look at the first segment there, the 5 ways dying has changed since 1900. Okay, this is so easy, and it comes across as so hard. What is it that your teacher wants to know from that chunk? The 5 ways dying has changed since 1900. Well, all your teacher wants to know is, what are the 5 ways dying has changed since 1900? She wants you to be able to list them. Okay, so what does she want you to know about thanatology? She wants you to know the definition of thanatology. This really isn't hard, but we really make it hard sometimes. So go down your list of your notes and look and see, what is it I'm supposed to be knowing here? And again, this follows right along with not really knowing what the purpose is of what it is that we're doing. We're just getting information, but we're not understanding why sometimes. I also want my students to know the main causes of death in 1900 and the main causes of death in 2000. So what could I do with this? Over here in this column to the left, I could actually make a list. And here's what it is. I made a list. This is what my teacher wants me to know. The 5 ways dying has changed, thanatology definition, main causes of death, etc., etc. Okay? Now why is that useful? That begins a good list of what it is that I need to be sure that I know. And how could that be useful to me? Well, we'll find out a little bit later. You need to make an effort to consciously store the things you need to know. Going over your notes, just reading over will not do it. Reading the text a dozen times will not do it. You need to focus on your need to know list. Now, when I'm doing a workshop in person, one of the things that I often ask people to do is to think of a familiar route that they drive regularly, whether it's from home to work or home to school or whatever. And then I ask them, can you please tell me a billboard that you pass? Well, I've had people tell me there are no billboards. I have had people tell me, why sure, and they can list a billboard. Rarely can they give me any details about that billboard. Now, my point is if you have driven this route 9 million times like some of us have, and you've read those signs, why can't you remember them? Sometimes we've read them hundreds of times, but we still can't remember them. My theory on this is that reading is just taking in information. It doesn't, unless we do something to make it stick, it isn't necessarily going to stick there. The only time I've successfully had somebody do this was when I asked one of the deans when I was doing a workshop for the staff, and he said yes. He said it's such and such insurance man, and his phone number is such and such. And now he's worked here for over 20 years, probably over 25 years. And I said, wow, that's really impressive. How did you do that? And he said, it's my next door neighbor. So that was why he could remember it, not because he'd read it 8 million times. So my thoughts are on this, that there are things that you would normally do if you wanted to retain the information. If I said, I'll give you $100, which I won't do, if you can show up tomorrow and tell me a billboard with the information on it, I'm sure that you could find a way to make that happen. So you want to stop and think about what you would do. Most people say they would write it down, or they would do something like that. But the very first thing that they would do would be they would pick one. They would not, and I say to this every time, I said, well, I can tell you what you would not do. You would not drive back and forth for hours and hours and hours reading all the billboards, hoping one would stick. So when I tell students they have to learn to extract what it is they need to know, that's what I'm talking about. You pick one, just like you look at the chapter and you pick out the information you need. Okay, we want to focus on learning and understanding what you need to know rather than just memorizing. So we want to learn chunks of information because we learn chunks of information better than large amounts of information. I believe in general psychology they tell you that you learn chunks of information better than large amounts. And when I'm doing a live workshop, I'll ask students, can you tell me your phone number, or can you tell me your social security number, which I really don't want to know their phone number or their social security number. They could make one up. But let's suppose if I ask the student and he says, oh, my number is 785326011. What are the odds that I will be able to repeat that back to him? Not very good. How about if I ask someone again and they say, oh, my number is 485-532-6122, which is better. Obviously, for most of us, the chunking is better than just getting a whole bunch of pieces of information. So I like to have people chunk up their assignments as they work. So you want to use a variety of methods to make the information stick in your head. Don't just keep reading the whole chapter over and over. Chunk it up, find out what's in there, learn to extract. Make lists, use note cards, tape recordings, music, dance, charts, graphs. Do your own. If you like charts and graphs, or you like color, clay, drawing, painting, do those things. I've had students that she had such trouble with a sociology class one time, and she said, Jane, I just can't get it. And I said, okay, well, why don't you try painting it? Because she was a painter, and she looked at me like I was crazy, and she said, why didn't anybody ever tell me this before? The last I heard from her, she was very successful as she went on to a university, and she was studying in Italy and doing quite well. So we all have different things that work for us, but that got her out of her rut. Maybe you want to have study groups, maybe you have a spouse, and the thing is if you're using a spouse or a significant other or your friend or children, they don't have to understand what it is you're talking about. You can just give them your notes from the Cornell method of note-taking and say, can you read these and see if I can recall them? And give them a chance. I have many students who study anatomy and physiology with their children. The kids love it and think it's fun learning about all the different body parts. Another method you might try is mnemonic devices, and we're going to talk about that in a minute, but use whatever it takes and try to be creative. Don't just sit in one place and read, but try some different things. Focus on understanding rather than memorizing. You want to narrow your list down, your list of the things you need to know, to not necessarily fewer items, but fewer words necessary for each one, so that you don't ever try to memorize a sentence, but you try to memorize the fewest words possible that give you the meaning of whatever it is. That way, when you respond back, you will be responding in your own words rather than the book's words and rather than the teacher's words. So it really does help us understand. So, time to practice retrieval using your learning styles or any learning styles. Just try some different kinds of things. Practice formulas and problems. Now here, the next thing here is study both directions. What on earth does that mean? If we're going to take the list from the Cornell method of note-taking, we're going to take a page out of the book, and on the left side you've got a list of terms, and on the right side maybe you've got the definitions. If you always practice recalling the definition, then you may have a problem when it comes to the test, because when it comes to the test, the teacher may ask the definition first and say, "What is this?" and you have to come up with the word. And you don't want to study things in order the same time every way. Are you one of those people who, if I ask you your social security number, you can't get to the middle two without saying the first three first? So we have to be careful with some things like this, because it kind of puts us in a makes it more difficult to retrieve what we need when we want it. You want to watch out for study guides, because when we use study guides, we tend to just look at the question on the study guide and keep practicing with the answer rather than doing it the other way as well. Here are some study techniques to store information and practice retrieval. Okay, first of all, here is our Cornell method of note-taking. We've got our notes to the right. We have our list of what we need to know that we've made to the left. Now, what can we do with it now? Ta-da! We're going to fold the page over. If a person prefers the audio, or if they prefer interpersonal actions, they could either say these things into a tape recorder to get the audio, or they could have someone read them to them and practice the answers. The visual learner could read and answer them, and then look at the notes under the fold. The tactile learner might practice writing the answers. Now, these are some simple ways. There are a lot of other things that you could do. The visual learner could draw them, or the tactile learner could draw them. You know, perhaps you want to make a chart. Perhaps you want to make put them in color. All kinds of different things that you can do. If you want to do note cards, you want to put as little as possible on the note cards. I used to hate doing note cards because I'd try to write out the whole sentence of a definition. Well, we don't want that. What is arrhythmia? Irregular rhythm, especially the heart. Well, that tells me exactly what it is in 4 very short words without having to be a sentence. The good part about note cards is that you can mix them up and you can change them around and you can take them out and you can have a rubber band around them and put them in your pocket or your bag or your purse or whatever it is, and take them out and practice at different times. Sometimes it's better to practice for 10 minutes somewhere doing something than to sit down for some huge study hour. Okay, here is another thing that we need to be careful about. Graphs and drawings. Beware! Okay, here is a graph, or a drawing, I'm sorry, of the lobes of the brain. Over there on the left, upper left, you see frontal. Lower left, you see temporal. Upper right is parietal. And lower right is occipital. Okay, what could go wrong here? Lots of things. For one thing, one of the anatomy teachers tells me that this is one of the hardest things that our students have to do. They can't seem to look at drawing in the textbook and then label a different drawing that she has, and I'm going to show you why in just a minute. Study that for just a second and see if you're going to be able to pass this test. You ready? Okay, can you label these things? I would like to know how many of you looked at the upper left and put frontal, and how many of you looked below that and put parietal. Well, that isn't it. What happened here was that the drawing was the same, but the lines weren't. So the lines went to different places on the brain. One of the things that we tend to do when we are trying to memorize graphs and pictures and so forth is that we memorize exactly what we see, and we don't memorize what the meaning is or what it really really goes to here. Here are some examples of mnemonics. Mnemonic devices are terrific. That's the way that most doctors get through medical school. There are all kinds of different mnemonic devices. Some you're familiar with, sometimes not. Probably the most common would be Colors of the Rainbow, which is Roy G. Biv. Red, orange, yellow, green, blue, indigo, and violet. And those are just the first letter of each one. Then in geography, to remember the names of the Great Lakes. I love this one. It's Holmes, and it's so easy. Huron, Ontario, Michigan, Erie, and Superior. I have never been able to remember the Great Lakes, so I'm pretty happy with that one. But there are many, and you can make up your own. I remember taking a class some years ago. It was a Christian ethics class, and I had to memorize the 10 Commandments in order with the right words. And the way I did it was to set up a mnemonic device of my own, and I would practice this every day when I was driving to work, and it was Our Granny never stopped fixing kraut and southern fried chicken. Now, that makes absolutely no sense to you, I'm sure, but my grandmother was married to a German man, and she did fix kraut, and I'm sure she fixed southern fried chicken. I never met her, but it worked great for my mnemonic device, and I'll be able to come up with the 10 Commandments in order for the rest of my life, I hope, because I'm not likely to forget that. Here's some more mnemonic devices. Some of them, you know, the one for the functions of the blood, oxygen, carbon dioxide, food, heat, waste, hormones, disease, and clotting. I don't like old Charlie Foster hates women having dull clothes. I think not. I think I could come up with something a little more creative than that. So this is a good thing to play with. Mind mapping. Here's an excellent example of mind mapping. That's organizing things. Let's suppose my students know they have to do an essay on the 5 ways dying has changed since 1900. They could draw it out like this, and then from each of those main topics they could have little spokes that come out further and give examples of 2 reasons why we live longer, 2 reasons of why the media is different, 2 reasons why we're less religious, and so forth. So this is good for somebody who is a visual learner, somebody who is a tactile learner, somebody who wants to practice as an audio learner, and they can draw this maybe on a whiteboard, or they can do something with it to show their children. Drawing and speaking at the same time. Okay, here's a big mind mapping thing for the microscope. I don't think I could remember that, but there are things that I could remember. What I would do if I were trying to learn this, I would probably look at A, and I see there's an A for arm, and then there are 2 B's and 1 C, so I'd go A, B, B, C, and then I would try to come up with a rhythmic way to remember the parts of the microscope. Usually if I can get the first letter, I can come up with what the term is. And you will be able to do that too. Study groups can be good or bad. Sometimes they're too social. That's not good. But you really don't want to be social, and you do want to be picky. I was pleased in college that most of the people in my class knew I was determined in graduate school to do really, really well, because I had not done really, really well as an undergraduate. So they knew I wanted it really badly and to get my good grades, and so I was pleased that the really studious students in my master's level class picked me to be in their study group, and I was very, very serious about it. It worked great. We had 16 chapters for a test. We had 4 people in the group, 4 chapters per person. We each studied our 4 chapters, came up with mnemonic devices, came up with lists, came up with explanations, charts, and met once a week and lectured on whatever it was that our 4 chapters were, and prepared handouts for the rest. It was great, and the good thing was no matter how much we couldn't remember of the other people's stuff, we sure got our stuff right. So study groups can be good, but not if somebody doesn't do their part. Use the internet. I don't know that we'll be able to link onto this at this moment, but perhaps. Textbook companion sites are great. They have all kinds of things. They have study guides. They have practice things that you can practice with terms and definitions. So try to find the companion site for your text. There are also other resources listed in the text. Then there are mnemonics databases. There's a great place called StudyStack, and it's based on note cards, but you can play hangman. You put your information in, and it lets you make crossword puzzles and do all sorts of neat stuff. Additionally, other schools and other teachers may have provided study guides for their students. So look around the internet for another college somewhere else in this country and look up the same class. It's not going to be the same number, but it's probably going to be the same name or the same textbook. See if that person has provided study guides for her students. You can use them too. Then there are certainly general subject study guides. There are math sites, there are English sites. The Purdue Outlet is great for English. Helps you with just about everything that you need to know. General study tips. Use a planner, a semester planner, a monthly planner, weekly, daily. I prefer all three of those actually. I want to plan my week, so I want a weekly, but I want to put everything that's for the future in the monthly, either a monthly or a semester calendar, so that I can see ahead, so that I can say, no, I'm not going to be able to do that next Wednesday because I have a test the following day, or I can get started on my book review prior to the day before it's due. So study your own way and try to make it fun. Try the Cornell method of note-taking, see how it works for you. Try studying with a variety of different ways and see if that doesn't help. Practice, practice, practice. Yes, you got to practice retrieval a whole lot in order to do well in college. Try making some mnemonic devices or use mind mapping. Make your study time short and often. Use the time that you have. Don't kid yourself. Try to block out 3 hours at 11 o'clock at night. What do you think you're going to retain if you study from 11 to 2 in the morning? And how fresh will you be the next day? And how much will you remember? If you need help, get help. Most schools have tutoring and help places. They have English help room here at Logan. There's a biology help room here at Logan, and there's also free tutoring. And the teacher is there to help you. Teachers have office hours, and they're supposed to be in their office during the office hours for the student. The final, absolutely crucial, necessary, mandatory, important thing that you need to know that goes without saying is that you really do need to take care of yourself. You need to eat right, you need to sleep enough, you need to get some exercise and take a little time for yourself each day, each week, and each month. I'd like to thank you for coming with me along the little path to look at ways of being successful in college. I hope you've learned some things and I hope you've enjoyed it. I certainly did, and I wish you good luck. Thank you.